Marcos, a young man whose past remains a mystery, grew up in an orphanage. He has no clear memory of his family or origins, except for a strange star-shaped pendant he has always worn around his neck. This piece of jewelry is his only tangible link to an unknown past, and despite the questions that haunt him, no one at the orphanage has ever been able to tell him more about it. Day after day, he gazed at this star, wondering who it belonged to and why it was left to him. At 18, armed with few resources but a fierce determination to build a future, Marcos left the orphanage. The idea of forging a new life, far from the dreary walls where he grew up, motivated him to overcome the countless obstacles he faced. His first years on the outside were particularly difficult. Without money or a network, he took on a string of odd jobs, often precarious and poorly paid, just to survive. He sometimes slept in makeshift shelters, battled hunger and loneliness, but never lost hope for a better life. Whenever he thought about giving up, he clutched his pendant in his hand, like a talisman carrying an invisible promise. After several years of relentless struggle, Marcos finally secured a stable job as an aquaculturist at the sprawling estate of Esteban Martinez. A highly wealthy and respected businessman, Esteban owned lush lands and a magnificent mansion surrounded by vast ponds used for breeding rare fish. The perfectly maintained estate was a symbol of wealth and power. Yet behind this dazzling facade lay a man tormented by a tragedy he could not forget. Despite his resounding success in the business world, Esteban was consumed by silent grief, the unexplained disappearance of his only son decades earlier. Though his fortune continued to grow and his influence in high society circles was undeniable, the loss of his child remained an open wound in his life. Every day, he thought about that tragic event that changed the course of his existence, wondering what he could have done to prevent the disappearance. His efforts and investigations to find his son had failed, leaving him without answers. This void in his heart gradually turned into an omnipresent shadow, preventing him from finding peace, even at the height of his success. Marcos's first day on the job was marked by palpable tension. Upon his arrival, he was greeted by Alberto Ruiz, Esteban Martinez's butler, a man whose mere presence commanded respect. Alberto, dressed impeccably, had the air of a former military officer, with measured movements and rigid features. He observed Marcos with a coldness that betrayed immediate mistrust, as if scrutinizing every newcomer before they even spoke. His piercing gaze seemed capable of reading flaws and hidden intentions, a skill honed by years of service in this household where excellence was an absolute requirement. Although slightly intimidated, Marcos strove to remain calm. He knew that first impressions were crucial. As he followed Alberto through the vast, impeccably maintained gardens, his eyes lingered on the vibrant flower beds, the pathways lined with sculptures, and the fountains softly singing in the morning air. The estate seemed almost unreal, a world of its own, far removed from the harshness of the outside world he had known until then. Yet despite the beauty of the place, Marcos couldn't escape the growing nervousness within him. Alberto's authoritative silence only reinforced the impression that he was being evaluated constantly, as if a single misstep could see him dismissed from this prestigious environment. "This is where you'll be working," Alberto finally said in a curt tone, breaking the oppressive silence that had hung over them since their meeting. They had arrived at a large greenhouse housing freshwater pools for breeding rare fish. The faint sound of fish swimming beneath the surface contrasted with the tense atmosphere emanating from the butler. Marcos nodded silently, knowing this was his chance to prove his worth. Yet, he couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, as if every move he made would be meticulously scrutinized by Alberto, ready to pass judgment. Alberto stood straight, arms crossed, monitoring Marcos's every motion. His strict demeanor left no room for error. He was the keeper of the rules and traditions of this household, with zero tolerance for incompetence. "The master does not tolerate mediocrity," he said brusquely. "Everything here must be done perfectly. Every task, no matter how small, is important. Never forget that." His words were almost a warning, a way of letting Marcos know that even the smallest mistake would not go unnoticed. Fully aware of the pressure on him, Marcos responded with a respectful nod. "I understand, Mr. Ruiz. I'll do my best." Though simple, his response was sincere. He knew this job was a unique opportunity, a chance to finally escape the struggles that had defined his life. But he also understood that to survive here, he would not only need to learn quickly, but also earn the trust of this stern man. After a moment of silence, Alberto added, in a tone slightly more conciliatory but still distant, "If you need anything, speak to me directly. I don't tolerate troublemakers." The brief statement carried weight. It signaled that despite his apparent coldness, Alberto saw discipline as a necessary tool to maintain order in the house, but he could also be an ally if Marcos proved himself worthy. The young man immediately set to work, feeling Alberto's imposing presence behind him at every moment. The first hours were marked by Marcos's intense concentration. He carefully cleaned the pools, checked the water quality, and ensured every task was carried out with precision. He wanted to show that he deserved his place here, that he was not just an inexperienced orphan, but someone capable of integrating into this world of excellence. As the day progressed, Alberto eventually moved away, but Marcos knew he would always be under observation in one way or another. The butler wasn't a man to leave anything to chance, and Marcos had to prepare for each day to feel like another test. Days passed, and Marcos adapted to his new life on Esteban Martinez's estate, keeping to himself and avoiding unnecessary attention. He preferred to remain in the background, fully absorbed in his work as an aquaculturist, whether maintaining the ponds or tackling the more intricate tasks associated with the rare species bred on the estate. Yet, despite his efforts to stay unnoticed, an imperceptible tension began to build around him. The staff, accustomed to the routine of the property, gradually noticed the master of the house's lingering gaze whenever he crossed paths with Marcos. One particularly sunny afternoon, as a light breeze rippled across the surface of the ponds, Marcos was focused on adjusting the water filtration systems. He paid no attention to the faint sound of footsteps approaching him. Esteban Martinez, a businessman of seemingly unshakable composure, was strolling through the gardens, his thoughts visibly elsewhere. It was not his habit to linger near the staff, but this time, something caught his attention. Rounding a path lined with exotic flowers, his eyes fell on Marcos's figure. It wasn't the young man himself that intrigued him, but the star-shaped pendant hanging from his neck, glinting in the sunlight. Esteban froze abruptly, as though struck by a memory he had long buried deep in his mind. His eyes locked onto the object, and his heart began to race. The star-shaped pendant, there was no doubt. It was identical to the one his son had worn on the day he was abducted years ago. A unique piece, custom-made for his son's birthday. A wave of shock overwhelmed Esteban, and his legs seemed to falter under the weight of the emotion. How could this young man possess such an object? For a moment, he lost all sense of the present. Painful images from the past surged into his mind with startling clarity. His son's smile, the laughter that once filled the house, and then that cursed day when everything fell apart. The absence, the silence, the abduction, and the despair that followed. Despite years of searching and investigations, he had never found any trace of his child. That pendant was the last thing he had seen around his son's neck before he disappeared forever. Esteban was overwhelmed by a wave of pain and hope mingled. His gaze remained fixed on Marcos, as though the young man held a hidden key to his past. A torrent of conflicting emotions coursed through his mind. Could it be a coincidence? A cruel twist of fate? Or was it possible that this young man was somehow connected to his missing son? Without hesitation, Esteban hurriedly left the gardens, leaving Marcos, unaware of the turmoil he had just caused, to continue his work. His mind racing, Esteban immediately sought out Alberto Ruiz, his loyal butler. He needed answers. He needed to understand where the pendant had come from. Esteban found Alberto in one of the estate's grand walkways, giving instructions to a group of gardeners. With a quick gesture, he called him aside. Esteban's face, usually impassive, now betrayed an unusual nervousness. Alberto, taken aback by his master's demeanor, silently followed him to a more secluded spot. "Alberto," That young man, the one working by the ponds, Marcos. Who exactly is he? Esteban asked, his voice trembling with suppressed emotion. Alberto, a man of unshakable discipline, furrowed his brow slightly, intrigued by his master's sudden urgency. Marcos? He's a young orphan, sir. He was hired recently. He grew up in an orphanage in the region. I made sure everything was in order with his references. Alberto's words echoed in Esteban's mind. An orphan? His thoughts swirled. If Marcos had grown up in an orphanage, it might explain why he wore the pendant, but how is that possible? How could such a deeply personal and intimate object have ended up around the neck of this stranger? Esteban felt disoriented. The possibility that he might be on the verge of uncovering a crucial piece of his past unsettled him deeply. But Alberto could provide no further details. He only knew the official story of Marcos, a young man with no family who had worked hard to make a life for himself and whose existence seemed, at first glance, unremarkable. Did he tell you how he got that pendant? Esteban asked, the urgency in his voice impossible to miss. Alberto shook his head, puzzled by this line of questioning.
No, sir.
I don't concern myself with such details. But if it's troubling you, I can question him. Esteban hesitated. The pendant had stirred a whirlwind of hope in him, but also a terrible fear. The fear of being disappointed yet again. He had to be sure of what he was seeing before jumping to conclusions. He wasn't ready to confront Marcos. Not yet. Not without knowing more. Still, the fact that the young man wore this object could not be a coincidence. The thought crept into his mind, growing stronger with each passing moment. The truth felt within reach, but Esteban knew he had to proceed cautiously. Troubled and unable to focus on his work, Esteban spent the following days observing Marcos from a distance, searching for clues in the way he spoke, moved, or even in the features of his face, anything to suggest a possible connection to his lost son. Each day, the glimmer of the star-shaped pendant around Marcos's neck became an enigma he needed to solve, a familiar detail that haunted him relentlessly. Esteban, usually cold and calculating, found himself consumed by an unfamiliar uncertainty, a mix of hope and fear driving him to seek answers to questions he wasn't yet ready to voice. Meanwhile, Marcos continued his work, blissfully unaware of the intrigue building around him. Young, discreet, and focused on his tasks, he performed his duties efficiently, oblivious to the silent storm his presence had caused. Yet he increasingly felt the intense gaze of the estate's master upon him. What initially seemed like indifferent glances, typical of a boss towards an employee, grew more persistent, almost invasive. At first, Marcos thought it might be a sign of interest in his work or perhaps even a tacit acknowledgement of his efforts. But as the days passed, the attention became unsettling. Esteban's silent observation from afar made Marcos uneasy. Sensitive to unspoken dynamics, he began to question the sudden interest. Why would a man so powerful and typically distant concern himself with a mere employee, someone he usually wouldn't even exchange a word with? Marcos shared his concerns with no one, not even Alberto, his longtime colleague and confidant. He wasn't the type to seek trouble or entertain far-fetched ideas. But the strange surveillance began to weigh on him. Every move, every action, seemed scrutinized, analyzed, as if there was more at stake than his job. The growing tension seeped into his daily life, leaving Marcos puzzled and wary. What was Esteban looking for? One morning, as Marcos cleaned the ponds, Esteban finally decided to act. The uncertainty gnawing at him had become unbearable, each day bringing him closer to questions he had no answers to. Approaching Marcos, Esteban feigned an inspection of the grounds, his heart pounding faster than he wanted to admit. The young man, engrossed in his work, straightened immediately when he saw his employer coming toward him, his expression a mix of surprise and respect. Esteban, attempting to appear detached, leaned slightly to examine the fish in the water, struggling to mask his inner turmoil. How are you finding things here, Marcos? Is the work to your likings? Esteban asked with feigned nonchalance, his hands clasped behind his back. Marcos, slightly taken aback by this sudden approach, responded politely, as he always did, "Yes, sir. I'm grateful for the opportunity." His tone was respectful, but he couldn't help wondering why someone as busy as his employer was taking the time to engage with him. Esteban nodded, though his mind was elsewhere. His eyes, despite himself, kept drifting back to the star-shaped pendant around Marcos's neck, glinting softly in the morning light. To anyone else, the piece of jewelry would be insignificant, but to Esteban, it was an obsession, a haunting reminder of a past he thought was buried. Unable to hold back any longer, he finally asked the question that had plagued him for days, his voice quieter, almost hesitant. "That pendant you're wearing," he began, speaking with deliberate slowness. "Where did you get it?" Marcos, caught off guard by the unexpected question, instinctively lowered his gaze to the star hanging from his neck. It was rare for anyone to notice the pendant, let alone someone as imposing as Esteban. For a moment, he remained silent, searching for the right words, puzzled as to why it might interest such a powerful man. "I've always had it, sir," he replied finally, his voice tinged with a disarming sincerity. "It's the only thing I have from my parents. I don't know anything about them. I already had it when they found me at the orphanage." The word struck Esteban like a thunderclap. The orphanage. His suspicions, buried beneath layers of skepticism, surged to the surface with unexpected force. The star-shaped pendant, this small yet profoundly symbolic item, was more than just a piece of jewelry. It was a direct link to his past, to what he had lost so many years ago. Esteban felt his chest tighten, his hands trembling slightly as he fought to conceal his emotions. "The orphanage, you say?" he murmured, almost to himself, his eyes locking onto Marcos's with an intensity that startled the young man. He was searching, desperately, for confirmation, an answer only he could understand. His thoughts spiraled into chaos, old memories flooding back in a torrent, reopening wounds he had spent years trying to heal. Esteban's heart skipped a beat. It was exactly what he both feared and hoped for. This pendant had belonged to his missing son. He was certain of it. The shape, the engraved details, they were too precise to be a mere coincidence. But now, a whirlwind of questions engulfed him, clouding his thoughts. If Marcos had grown up in an orphanage with this pendant, did that mean he truly was his son? Or had he crossed paths with him somehow after the abduction? Each potential answer seemed to open a new cascade of uncertainties. Unable to remain calm in the face of this inner storm, Esteban murmured in a hoarse voice, almost as though speaking to himself, "That pendant, it belonged to my son. He disappeared when he was a child." His words were heavy, laden with pain and long-buried memories. Marcos froze, his eyes widening as the weight of Esteban's words sank in. At first confused, he began to grasp the gravity of the situation. This pendant, the small trinket he had worn all his life without understanding its significance, might hold the key to a past he had never known. A lump formed in his throat. He had never imagined that this simple object could carry such profound meaning. "Your son?" he stammered, his words hesitant as if struggling to process the incredible revelation. Overcome by emotion he could no longer contain, Esteban abruptly turned on his heels. He couldn't bear the weight of the moment any longer. The suppressed pain of his son's disappearance resurfaced with unexpected force, mingling with a fragile glimmer of hope he dared not fully embrace. His hurried, nervous footsteps echoed across the ground as he walked away, leaving Marcos standing alone, stunned and perplexed by the strange confession. Marcos remained frozen, trying to collect his thoughts. He glanced again at the pendant, the star glinting around his neck, seeing it now as if for the first time, in an entirely new light. The mere possibility that he could be the lost son of such a powerful, influential man felt unreal, almost impossible. And yet, he couldn't ignore the sincerity in Esteban's voice, the anguish that had been so evident in his words. Doubt began to creep into everything Marcos thought he knew about his past. The orphanage, his modest life, it all seemed so far removed from the story that had just been revealed. Questions flooded his mind. How had he ended up in the orphanage? Why had no one ever searched for his parents? And if, against all logic, Esteban was right, if he really was the missing son, what would that mean for him? These thoughts gnawed at him relentlessly, and a growing sense of unease took root in his heart. His life, once simple and orderly, was now spiraling into dizzying uncertainty. Marcos knew he had to uncover the truth. But how could he approach it? How could he face this man, a stranger who suddenly felt so close, and discover if he was truly his father? Esteban, unable to endure the gnawing uncertainty any longer, decided to take matters into his own hands. He knew he couldn't rely solely on intuition or coincidences, no matter how compelling they seemed. He needed proof, concrete answers. The thought of losing this faint glimmer of hope terrified him, but he had to know. Could Marcos truly be his son, or was it all a cruel trick of fate? Without delay, Esteban hired a private investigator, a trusted professional named Javier Mendoza, known for his discretion and meticulous methods. Javier, a seasoned former investigator, was adept at uncovering even the most deeply buried secrets. Esteban entrusted him with a clear mission: conduct a discreet investigation into Marcos's past without alerting the young man or raising suspicion. The detective's task was to delve into the records of the orphanage where Marcos had grown up, track down old files, adoption reports, and, if possible, locate witnesses from that time. Javier was to reconstruct the early years of Marcos's life with as much precision as possible. Esteban also handed over the only photograph he had of his son at the age of 3, a faded but still recognizable image. This portrait, he hoped, might provide a crucial lead in this arduous search. Javier accepted the mission with professional resolve, though he knew such investigations could be time-consuming, especially if records had been lost or scattered over the years. Nevertheless, he set to work immediately, combing through archives of public and private institutions, discreetly questioning former employees of the orphanage, and digging through forgotten files in dusty administrative offices. Meanwhile, Esteban, racked with impatience and anxiety, did his best to maintain his composure around Marcos. Each day, he continued to observe him from a distance, searching for any clue, an expression, a gesture, something that might betray a deeper connection. Yet he avoided direct confrontation, fearing he might reveal his suspicions before Javier uncovered the truth. For his part, Marcos still noticed the unusual attention but said nothing. He simply went about his work, though he couldn't shake the feeling that something extraordinary was unfolding behind the scenes. Days turned into weeks. Esteban received regular updates from the detective, but so far, nothing concrete had surfaced. The investigation was stalling, and the lack of tangible evidence only deepened Esteban's anxiety. Javier had tracked down a few former employees of the orphanage, but none could recall the precise circumstances of Marcos's arrival. The records had been poorly kept at the time, and much of the information seemed to have been lost over the years. One evening, just as Esteban was on the verge of abandoning hope, he received a call from Javier. The investigator's usually calm and composed voice carried a hint of excitement. "Mr. Esteban, I think we've found something. I came across an old orphanage registry. It states that Marcos was brought there by a woman who claimed she found him near a train station, alone and disoriented. She didn't know anything about him, and no trace of his parents was ever discovered. But there's another detail." Esteban's heart raced. What detail? The description of the pendant he was wearing. A star engraved with a unique symbol, exactly like the one your son had. The noose was tightening. A wave of emotion overwhelmed Esteban. At last, he had a lead, something concrete linking Marcos to his missing son. But the investigation was far from over. There were still so many questions. How had Marcos ended up alone? Who had abandoned him? And most importantly, why had no one ever searched for him? Javier continued his inquiries, but for Esteban, one thing became clear: he would soon need to confront Marcos with the truth. Yet he hesitated. How would Marcos react? How could he tell him that he might be his father after all these years of ignorance? Esteban knew the revelation would upend Marcos's life, just as it had already shaken his own. That night, Esteban sat alone in his office, staring into the void. Memories of his son came flooding back, his laughter, their childhood games, and the tragic day that had changed everything. Suddenly, he stood, determined not to let this chance slip away. The next day, he invited Marcos for coffee after work. The atmosphere was tense, almost electric. Sitting across from him, Esteban felt the weight of the words he was about to speak. Marcos, absorbed in the routine of his job, seemed oblivious to the storm brewing in Esteban's mind. Marcos, I need to talk to you about something important, Esteban began, his voice trembling with anxiety. The young man looked up, surprised by his employer's serious tone. Is everything all right, sir? He asked, concern flickering in his eyes. I believe there's a connection between us. A connection that goes back a long way, Esteban confessed, his heart pounding. Marcos blinked, unsure how to respond. A connection? What kind of connection?
I
think you might be my son, Marcos. The words fell between them like a heavy weight. Marcos stared, incredulous. Your son? But how could that be possible? Esteban felt his chest tighten. Every word felt like a burden. I've been investigating your past. I've discovered things about the orphanage where you grew up, about how you came to be there. And that pendant you wear, it belonged to my son, who's been missing for so long. Marcos paled as the reality began to dawn on him. Wait, are you sure? The details match, Esteban replied, his voice barely above a whisper. I hired a detective to look into your history. He found evidence that points to you being the son I lost. Marcos began to tremble, a whirlwind of emotions, anger, confusion, wonder, swirling within him. Why didn't you tell me sooner? Why watch me from a distance, without saying anything? I wanted to be sure before I said anything. I was afraid of hurting you, or giving myself false hope, Esteban admitted, his eyes pleading. Marcos stood abruptly, unable to sit any longer. His mind was spinning, and he needed time to process the shocking revelation. There had always been an inexplicable void within him, a sense of absence he could never quite name. And now, this possibility, this promise of a father, it terrified and amazed him in equal measure. I need time to think, he finally said, walking away from the table. Esteban watched him leave, his heart heavy with a mix of worry and hope. He knew this conversation was only the beginning of a long and challenging journey. If Marcos was indeed his son, they would have to face difficult truths, complex emotions, and a past neither of them had chosen. The days that followed were filled with silence and doubt. Marcos didn't return to work, leaving Esteban in a state of unbearable anxiety. Each morning, he arrived at the office hoping Marcos would walk through the door, ready to talk. But day after day, his absence persisted, and with it grew the weight of regret. Esteban spent hours questioning whether he had acted too hastily, whether he had scared Marcos off by imposing this revelation on him. Had he shattered the fragile balance between them before it had a chance to form? The silence became more oppressive with each passing day. Every phone call made Esteban jump. Every shadow in the hallway reignited a flicker of hope. But there was nothing. No message, no word. He couldn't bear the thought of losing Marcos without trying to reach out to him, to explain what this discovery meant to him. Yet he knew he couldn't rush things. Marcos needed time to absorb what he had learned, to come to terms with the enormity of this potential truth. One morning, as Esteban stared distractedly at the papers on his desk, he heard a faint knock at the door. His heart leapt. The door opened slowly, and Marcos stepped inside. He looked different, calmer, but also deeply thoughtful. His eyes searched for Esteban's, and in his gaze was a new light. There was hesitation, but also a determination not to shy away from the unsettling truth they now faced. Esteban stood immediately, unsure of how to greet him. Marcos, he began, his voice barely audible. Marcos nodded, taking a deep breath before speaking. I needed time, he said simply, as if to explain his absence. I needed to understand what this all means to me. Esteban remained silent, sensing that Marcos had more to say. He didn't want to push him, but instead offered the space for him to express himself. When you told me I might be your son, Marcos paused, the words weighing heavily on his tongue. I didn't know how to react. All my life, I've lived without knowing where I came from, with nothing but this pendant. I had resigned myself to the idea that I had no family, that no one was looking for me. And then you show up, and everything changes. Esteban nodded gently, understanding the turmoil this revelation must have caused. I understand. It's a lot to take in. Maybe I shouldn't have confronted you so quickly. I didn't want to scare you. Marcos sat down across from him, his gaze momentarily fixed on the void. I've spent these past days thinking, wondering if it's possible, if you could really be my father. And I realized I can't ignore this possibility. I can't run from it. I need to know. Relief washed over Esteban. We can do tests to be sure if you're okay with that. I don't want to force you into anything. It's your decision. Marcos nodded, but an emotional shadow crossed his face. Yes, but it's not just about that. It's not just a question of a DNA test. I want to know who I was before all this. How I ended up in that orphanage. Why no one found me. Those questions had haunted Esteban as well. He knew they had a long journey ahead to uncover the full truth, but it was a step toward reconciliation. I've hired someone to investigate all of that, Esteban admitted. I already have some answers, but there are still many gaps. I promise we'll uncover the truth together. Marcos looked up at him, hesitating before asking the question that had burned inside him for days. If I really am your son, why didn't you come for me? Why did it take so long? The question hit Esteban like a blow. He felt his throat tighten. I did look for you, Marcos. For years, I did everything I could to find you. But I was led to believe that you were. He closed his eyes for a moment, trying to contain the emotion threatening to overwhelm him. I was told you were dead. I thought I had lost you forever. A heavy silence followed this revelation. Marcos, stunned, didn't know how to react. The father he had never known had spent years searching for him, grieving his loss. The very idea that he had been mourned as a lost child shook him to his core. Esteban continued in a quieter voice. I can't change the past. All the time we lost, I can never get that back. But what I can do is be here for you now. To give you all the answers you're looking for, to help you understand. Marcos, still silent, finally nodded. All right, he murmured. Let's do the test. And let's find out the truth. Together? A wave of relief flooded Esteban. It was a small step, but a step towards something greater, something deeper. They were ready to face the truth, no matter where it would lead them. For the first time, the hope of a true reconciliation appeared on the horizon, and this time, Esteban had no intention of letting his son slip away again. The days that followed were filled with palpable tension, each moment seeming to stretch endlessly. Esteban and Marcos scheduled an appointment for the DNA test, and though they had agreed to go through with it, anxiety and excitement mingled within them. They both knew that this test could change their lives forever. On the day of the test, Esteban offered to drive Marcos to the clinic. In the car, the silence was both comfortable and heavy with unspoken thoughts. Trying to break the ice, Esteban brought up mundane topics, the weather, work, even a few jokes to lighten the mood. But it was clear that Marcos's mind was elsewhere, lost in deep thoughts. You know, Marcos finally said, staring out the window, I never really had a father. My childhood was full of unanswered questions. I often wondered what it would be like to have a family. Esteban felt a dull ache in his heart. I can't imagine how hard that must have been for you. But I'm here now, and if it turns out I am your father, I'll do everything I can to be the father you deserve. Marcos turned to him, a mixture of gratitude and uncertainty in his eyes. Thank you, but I need to be sure of who I am. For all I know, I might not even be the person you hope I am. Esteban nodded, understanding Marcos's fears. This isn't about hope. It's about the truth. No matter what the test says, I'll still be here for you. When they arrived at the clinic, the atmosphere became more serious. They entered a small laboratory, where a technician greeted them with a professional smile. After completing a few formalities, they were ushered into a room where the tests would be conducted. The technician explained the process, and once they were both seated, Esteban watched Marcos intently. The young man seemed nervous, his hand trembling slightly as he completed the saliva sample. Esteban placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "It's going to be all right," he murmured. Marcos nodded, but the worry in his eyes lingered. Once the test was completed, they left the clinic in silence, the weight of the waiting period hanging heavily over them. Esteban knew they now had to wait a few days for the results, a delay that felt like an eternity. The following days passed slowly. Esteban and Marcos returned to their respective work, but the tension between them was palpable. They exchanged fleeting glances, each wondering what the future might hold. Marcos tried to focus on his tasks, but his mind was constantly clouded with doubts and unanswered questions. Finally, the day of the results arrived. Esteban received a call from Javier, who had been closely overseeing the matter. "Mr. Esteban, the results are ready. Would you like me to send them by email or read them to you directly?" Esteban felt his heart race. "Read them to me, please."
All right.
"I'll be direct," Javier began, his tone serious. "The results show a 99.9% match between you and Marcos. You are indeed his father." Esteban's breath caught, and a wave of emotions overwhelmed him. He was finally a father, but at what cost? The realization that Marcos, the man he had met by chance, was truly his son left him speechless. Tears of joy and relief welled in his eyes. "Esteban, are you there?" Javier asked, concerned. "Yes, I'm here," Esteban managed to reply, his voice trembling. "Thank you, Javier. Thank you so much." After ending the call, Esteban found himself lost in a whirlwind of thoughts. He knew he had to share the news with Marcos. But how? How could he convey a truth that would irrevocably change their lives? He decided to meet Marcos at the office. When Marcos entered, Esteban immediately noticed his anxiety. The young man seemed on the verge of breaking, his eyes searching desperately for an answer he didn't yet have. "Marcos, please sit down," Esteban said, his tone calm but firm. Marcos obeyed, his hands trembling slightly on his knees. Do you have any news?" Esteban took a deep breath, weighing each word carefully. "Yes, we have the results. And they show that I am your father." Silence fell, heavy and intense. Marcos's eyes widened and he froze, trying to process the information. "You're serious?" he finally asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Yes, it's true," Esteban confirmed, his voice thick with emotion. "You are my son, Marcos. I never stopped looking for you." Marcos stood abruptly, his face a mix of surprise and doubt. "How is this possible? Why didn't I ever know?" "It's a long story, but I want to explain everything to you," Esteban said, striving to remain calm despite the gravity of the moment. "I never wanted to lose you. You are the most precious thing in my life now." Tears streamed down Marcos's cheeks, a blend of disbelief and relief. He was caught between the joy of discovering his origins and the pain of the years spent in ignorance. I don't know what to say," he murmured, the words catching in his throat. "You don't need to say anything right now," Esteban said softly. "We have time. I'm here to help you make sense of all this. We're in this together." Marcos nodded, still in shock. The idea that he wasn't alone, that he finally had a father, was both comforting and overwhelming. They had found each other under the most improbable circumstances, but it was a new beginning. "What do we do now?" he asked, a flicker of hope beginning to shine in his eyes. "I want you to take your time to process this," Esteban replied. "But I think it's important for you to know where it all started. I want to share my story and your mother's story with you. I want you to understand where you come from." Marcos took a deep breath, a mix of curiosity and apprehension passing through him. "I'd like that. I want to know who I am." Esteban smiled, sensing that their journey together was just beginning. "Then let's start now. I'll tell you everything I know. Together, we'll uncover our past and build a future, one I hope will be bright." With that, they launched into a conversation that would mark the beginning of a new life, one filled with possibilities, redemption, and love. The father-son bond, long lost, had finally been found.